you for joining today's high-level panel on tackling food insecurity. And now, please welcome Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen.
Good morning. Welcome Christian and Sri Mulyani, who are joining us as this year's finance chairs of the G7 and G20, respectively. I'm also pleased to have Gilbert, David, and Kristalina here today as IFAD, the World Bank, and IMF are actively responding to the global impacts of the war in Ukraine. I wish we were meeting under different circumstances, but the reality is that we're facing rising global food insecurity. This threat touches the most vulnerable people the hardest, families that are already spending disproportionate amounts of their income on food. Moreover, the interconnectedness of the global food system means that people on every continent are impacted. Even before the war, over 800 million people were suffering from chronic food insecurity. That's 10% of the global population, and more than the populations of our panelists' 5 home countries combined. Poor nutrition and food insecurity have serious implications for economic well-being, social and political stability. The war has made an already dire situation worse. Price and supply shocks are already materializing, adding to global inflationary pressures, creating risks to external balances, and undermining the recovery from the pandemic. I want to be clear, Russia's actions are responsible for this. But the United States is urgently working with our partners and allies to help mitigate the effects of Russia's reckless war on the world's most vulnerable. Let there be no doubt, even as we continue escalating our sanctions and other economic measures against Russia, we reiterate our commitment to authorizing essential humanitarian and related activities that benefit people around the world, ensuring the availability of basic foodstuffs and agricultural commodities. We planned today's session with 3 objectives in mind, and let me introduce each in turn. First, let's better understand the drivers of rising global food insecurity, including underlying vulnerabilities that predated this war. Recent increases in food insecurity have been driven by conflict, climate change, and economic downturns, such as those associated with the pandemic. In 2020, the number of people experiencing chronic food insecurity increased by a devastating 160 million. Today, Russia's destruction of the Ukrainian economy and its infrastructure is a key factor affecting global commodity prices. The war further exacerbates pre-existing price and food supply pressures. Some countries and regions, which were already food insecure and facing emergencies, are now confronting additional price increases and supply disruptions for imported food, fuel, and fertilizers. Early estimates suggest that at least 10 million more people could be pushed into poverty due to higher food prices alone. Second, we should focus on how we can apply valuable lessons learned from past global food price crises to the current context. We know that we must avoid export restrictions that could further increase prices. We must quickly support the most vulnerable populations with social safety nets and targeted support for smallholder farmers so they can continue to produce. And we must not lose sight of the need to strengthen longer-term resilience, because this latest shock will unfortunately not be the last. In response to the 2008 crisis, the G20 launched the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program to increase investment in the world's poorest countries and an agricultural market information system. We must consider how these tools can be used and reinvigorated if needed to meet the needs of this moment. And finally, let's get concrete about the actions the international financial institutions can take to deliver an effective response. The IFIs are well placed to work with affected countries and partners to develop solutions. They can use their analytic tools to assess the specific needs of affected countries while also evaluating the macroeconomic impacts of the war. They can mitigate the global fertilizer shortage and smooth supply chain disruptions for food and critical supplies. They can increase investments in agricultural capacity and resilience to boost domestic food production. And they can provide targeted assistance and strengthen social safety nets to protect vulnerable people in the short term and build their resilience over the longer term. We have a strong international system, and we need to work together now. I know that my colleagues on this panel will set high expectations for what this system must deliver. After this panel, my colleague Alexia Latrotu, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development, will convene technical experts from the international financial institutions, including the multilateral development banks, IFAD, and the IMF, to develop an action plan for an effective and coordinated response. So thank you. I'll now turn to my colleague, Alexia, to facilitate our conversation.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for laying out the urgency of what is at stake and setting out our objectives today. Everyone here is deeply concerned about rising food insecurity. We know that FAO's food price index is at its highest level since inception in 1990. And we have seen the resulting uncertainty lead to protests in several countries. Let's begin our conversation today with IFAD President Gilbert Ogu. Welcome and thank you for joining us. President Ogu, what are some of the direct spillovers of Russia's war on Ukraine, and how are these compounding existing vulnerabilities? Could you also please reflect on the priorities for Rome-based food and agriculture agencies like IFAD in responding to rising food insecurity, including potentially through collaboration with the international financial institutions? President.
Thank you so much, Alexia, and good morning, Secretary Yellen. Good morning, David and Kristalina. Thank you so much for recognizing this, the urgency of the current situation. From where we sit in Rome, it is important, and Secretary Yellen mentioned it in her introductory remark, it's important to keep in mind that since 2014, the food insecurity has been going up. And we have really been raising this issue. So the past 10 years or so, the news were already not good because of the vulnerability. And COVID has made it, has exacerbated it. And now is Ukraine. So what we are seeing is climate change, then COVID, and Ukraine. And who knows, we can suspect that this is not the last global crisis that we are having. So it's quite crucial for us to look at it from a long-term building the resilience, which is one. Obviously, the short-term humanitarian intervention is crucial, and this is what our colleague from the humanitarian agencies' interventions are quite critical. Second point that I wanted to mention is that given the fact that the Ukraine crisis is having a direct impact mostly at the rural, the small-scale producers level. On one hand, in the past few days, I was very thrilled when David has announced the World Bank 170 billion initiative, the RST that Kristalina announced from the IMF, and there's a big hope, particularly for the low-income countries. What I really want to make a plea here is to recognize that those that are suffering from those crises obviously are the poorest, very fragile population community in the poorest country. So in addition to the macro, it is essential that we go down to the micro level, to the local level, to ensure how we address the issues at those levels, not only in terms of the emergency, making food available, which colleagues like WFP are doing quite very well, but to ensure that they have access to the improved seed, they have access to fertilizers for the next coming season. It's important for us to recall that 80% of the women and men that live in extreme poverty, they live in the rural area, not in the cities. Just imagine if you are a farmer in Somalia with small diesel engine to irrigate your crops, in a country where 68% of the population live on less than $2 a day, in a country where nearly 4 million are already food insecure, and then you have the drought and erratic rainfalls, what will you do then when the fuel prices are spiking as we are seeing now? How can you keep the same level of production and yield? Let's move from Somalia to Ghana, who is doing fairly, is not in a crisis country, in a normal development status. Yet imagine if you are a baker in Ghana, a country that imports 30% of its wheat from Russia. How will you keep working when you face both a disruption of the supply chain of wheat, or you cannot access even the wheat flour to be able to make your bread and others? And if you are able to make it, the price is so high that there's no client. Automatically, those small family businesses have to come to a standstill. This is why I'm really pushing hard that not only we have to intervene on the hard side, be it the increase of the production, increase of the transformation at the local level, the infrastructure, particularly rural infrastructure, but on the soft side, is important also to continue on the policy work that is already going on. And also, one of the problems we are not talking enough about is to encourage domestic consumption, and to encourage the bread being produced not only 100% with wheat flour, but with a mix of the wheat and maybe the millet or those local nutritious food that are being produced. The last important point that I really would like to mention, because I know we are limited on time, is the importance for us moving forward, not just looking at it as just food production and providing food on the table. It's also a matter of ensuring that there is a minimum social protection for the most vulnerable group, vulnerable communities. And that the producers, particularly those small-scale producers, they have their fair share in what they produce. They have that decent income, at least out of what they are producing. So right now they are double hit because not only we have the spiking in the prices, but even what they are producing, they barely are able to get their fair share. So the initiative like the one that I'm sure David and Kristalina are going to talk about, and I also know that the German under the G7 and the G20 under Indonesia, as well as the EU presidency, all have initiative. I really will call for all of us to harmonize. So I'm looking for the second panel, Alessia, that we can harmonize all our intervention. The end result, we need to scale up. We need to scale up and also make maximum use of technology for us to be able to scale up and increase the productivity of the small-scale producers. Thank you so much, Alessia.
Thank you so much, President Ubo. Macro and micro, short-term and long-term, scaling up and technology. Excellent. Let me now turn to World Bank President David Malpass. President Malpass, the World Bank has a strong track record supporting food security and agricultural production. Many eyes are now on you and your institution. What should the World Bank do to protect development gains and build long-term resilience? And what are some of the policy actions countries should be considering? President Malpass.
Thank you very much, Alexia, and thank you, Secretary Yellen and Gilbert. It's good to be here with you, with Kristalina, everyone here today. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered major threats to global food and nutrition security. In the near term, there's been the pronounced spike in the prices of food staples. That includes wheat and also wheat substitutes. And second, the future harvests may be reduced due to higher energy and fertilizer prices. Crop yields all over the world depend on fertilizer and the price of oil and natural gas. Global food and fertilizer prices were already on the rise prior to the war. Food and nutrition insecurity were also rising. Gilbert just highlighted this. The reasons are many. They include growing demand, the supply chain disruptions, currency devaluations, climate change impacts. There's a rise in fragility and conflict. The deepening of the crisis in the last 2 months is directly related to the war in Russia and Ukraine, and also the cost in terms of shipping, logistics, and agribusinesses. We're seeing, I have some data, Alexia, we're seeing a deepening of the crisis in these numbers. The World Bank Food Price Index reached an all-time high, it rising 11.5% in March. That's a year-on-year increase of 37%. Fertilizer prices surged 20% in March since January, and the cost of urea has tripled since January 2021. And further, we're seeing a shift in relative prices. Carmen Reinhart has focused on this, explaining that when food prices are going up more than CPI, and that trend we think is going to continue, it really hurts the poorest and most vulnerable. They have to spend more on food. So when there's a relative price shift, that's harmful. In the developing world, a typical family of a poor family spends as much as 2/3 of their income on food. And our estimates show that for each 1% increase in the food prices, 10 million people may be thrown into extreme poverty. Food price increases are also creating vast needs in both low-income countries, but also in middle-income countries, where the World Bank fully works there as well. In fact, we think food insecurity right now is rising fastest in the middle-income countries, so we need to stay focused on that. responding appropriately is mission critical for the whole World Bank group because of the breadth of this crisis. Let me say a few words about our response. We're expecting to launch an overall surge in our financial support in coming weeks. Funding for food security will be an important component of this. Our package includes Ukraine, the countries hosting the refugees near Ukraine, and also developing economies more broadly, is in the range of $50 billion in the current quarter of 2022. And I think it can reach $170 billion in the 15 months through June 2023. So that's a responsive surge to both the food crisis and the other collateral damage. To be successful, couple more points. To be successful, we have to have both advanced and developing countries engaged. They need to increase market access by reducing export and import restrictions and relieving price controls. The central elements of the World Bank Group response to the current crisis include: one, encouraging food producers, enabling market access and private sector investment, and protecting the most vulnerable population through well-targeted and cost-effective cash transfers. These are key elements of my recent call to action with Kristalina Ngozi and David Beasley. Let me also mention two mechanisms that can be mobilized now alongside IDA and IBRD if we are going to boost food security and resilience in a well-coordinated way. First, the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, that's GAFSB, which has set up a G20 response in the 2007 and 2008 food crisis. It already works in the poorest countries through many of the institutions represented here today, so we can use that if we want. The World Bank also hosts a multi-donor trust fund. It's called Food Systems 2030. It can help countries strengthen their food systems to meet short and long-term goals both. So the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine must not be compounded by another tragedy, a global food crisis. To prevent it requires speed, supply enhancement, market access, and close coordination. So you can count on us to work with partners, all of you and partners around the world to help the people of developing countries. And I look forward to hearing the outcome of today's technical discussions that you mentioned. Beck, thank you, Alexia.
Thank you so much, President Malpass. The data is alarming. A low-income and middle-income country challenge, and market access, a point that Secretary Yellen also emphasized. Thank you so much. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, I would now like to turn to you. MD Georgieva, what are you seeing in terms of the macroeconomic impacts of the war? And what can the IMF do to help countries protect the most food insecure populations?
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Latortue, Alexia, for moderating this discussion. And I want to most sincerely thank Secretary Yellen for your focus on growing food insecurity and for bringing Gilbert and David to speak before me with so much passion and substance. So what has Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused? A crisis on top of a crisis with devastating human costs and a massive setback for the global economy. We just issued the World Economic Outlook. We project global growth to slow from 6.1% in 21 to 3.6% in 22, way below our January projection. We have downgraded our forecast for 143 countries. This represents 86% of global GDP. And very worrying, we have recorded inflation going up, reaching highest levels seen in decades. So in economic terms, growth is down, inflation is up. In human terms, incomes are down and hardship is up. And that applies so much when it comes down to food, with sharper higher prices for food, but also for fertilizers. They put pressure on households worldwide. And of course, this affects the poorest the most. We also know that a food crisis can unleash social unrest. And we also know lessons from experience from the 2007 and 2008 food crisis. What is the most important lesson? That fast and well-coordinated actions are critical to maintain open trade, to support vulnerable households, to ensure significant agricultural supply, and to address financing pressures. And as David said, we joined forces, World Bank, World Food Programme, WTO, IMF, to call for an urgent coordinated response by the international community. And Secretary Yellen, your proposal for an IFI action plan is exactly what we need. So what is our contribution from the IMF? We are committed to work closely with our partners, focusing on our comparative strength, our macroeconomic expertise. First, real-time analysis of the situation. We are assessing external financing needs across the most affected countries, complementing the food insecurity heat map developed by UN agencies and others with contribution of those who spoke before me. We will also work with the WTO to ensure that global and regional markets function properly. Second, we are providing tailored policy advice to country authorities to mitigate the impact of current food shortages and higher food prices through targeted fiscal policies and, of course, paying attention to social support to the most vulnerable. But we also work with them to build resilience to future shocks. We have a new strategy on fragile and conflict-affected states. It helps us support enhanced engagement with those countries most severely impacted by the food crisis. 3, we will contribute to financing balance of payment needs caused by the spike in food prices. We currently have 40 countries with active IMF-supported programs. They can be augmented to address additional financing needs. We are also ready to respond to financing requests from other countries, either through traditional programs or emergency financing where appropriate. We want to see, however, for poor countries, grants and highly concessional loans. We think of ourselves as being the third line of defense for them. And we will deploy the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust to help countries adapt agriculture to a world of more frequent and severe climate shocks. And let me say a word on what is top of mind for many of us. For several countries, this food crisis comes on top of a debt crisis. Since 2015, the share of low-income countries at or near debt distress has doubled from 30 to 60%. For many, debt restructuring is a pressing priority, and we need the G20 common framework to integrate lessons from experience, improve, and deliver for the countries turning to it for help. And we need large creditors like China and the private sector to urgently step up their participation. I want to end on a positive note. We know hunger is the world's greatest solvable problem, and a looming crisis is the time to act decisively and solve it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Managing Director. As always, so clear and plain spoken. The human law terms, incomes down and suffering and harm up, and then decisive action to make the difference. Thank you so much. I'm now very pleased that Indonesian Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati has joined us for capacity as G20 Finance Chair. Madam Minister, what are you hearing from G20 countries? What are their priority needs and concerns, and what do they expect from the international financial institutions. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Alexia. It's really good to see you again. I would like to maybe share this very important issue related to the food security, which is now becoming very, very important topic that when we are doing a lot of consultation from the G20 members, they are all expressing their view that this is becoming a very, very important issue that need to be addressed. First, of course, within the Indonesia G20 presidency, this will be relevant to be discussed on the first session when we are talking about global economic outlook. First, we design about the exit strategy, scarring effect because of the pandemic. Now, even before we can address the existing scarring effect, we have another, what Kristalina mentioned, crisis above the crisis. And that is because of the energy and food prices. You all know that food and energy are the two very important strategic commodity in any country. It can create a huge political and social unrest. And that's why it's always becoming very important to design the policy related to both energy and food security. Now, within this discussion about the food security in each country, like Indonesia is not unique. I think it's similar to many developing and emerging countries. First, on the production side, we are usually have the issue regarding the farmer or labor in this case, which hold a very small land size, or even they are just a labor on the farming activity vis-a-vis the big farming industry. So this is going to be one of the issue of the inequality. The small farmer holder versus the big. And then when you are going to address the issue regarding protecting the small farmer at the cost of the consumer, which is in many of the developing countries, they are also not really in a very good position. Low-income household definitely define in terms of their consumption of food as the majority of their consumption. So you really have faced with these two very difficult choice between protecting the small farmer vis-a-vis protecting the poor consumer. That is going to be the political and policy dilemma for any country. Using the fiscal tools is very important, of course, for us to be able to address the productivity on the production side, and that will require land management, technology, seed, fertilizer, which is now becoming very, very expensive, as well as the irrigation, that is infrastructure. And especially when we just discussed about climate change, this is going to be one of the most very critical issue about the irrigation. That will require a lot of investment. Public investment certainly becoming very limited when we are dealing with the fiscal space, which is extremely now has been eroded because of the pandemic. So the question is how we are going to invite private sector on this production side. The second one on the consumer side. Again, for many developing emerging countries, you are dealing with maybe low-income household. We just need to be protected. I think from the policy lesson, a lot of recommendation, as mentioned by David, regarding the targeted subsidy. So you subsidize based on the family by name, by address. So you are going to be able to directly support them rather than using the commodity, whether this is rice subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, or even energy subsidy. But of course, this is going to be politically very sensitive for many countries to change from the commodity-based subsidy to the targeted. So it's not about the ability or the understanding about that is actually the right policy, but how you actually manage the political implication when you change from this commodity-based subsidy into direct targeted subsidy. I think this is going to be one of the area which many, when I discuss with the G20, especially from the developing and emerging country, they want to also discuss about this food security and food price as one of the most important issue. So that's why within the G20, we are going to invite on the first session, now the intervention by the, in addition to Kristalina from the IMF, OECD, World Bank, we are going to also invite the FAO in order for us to be able to provide the perspective on what is the policy challenge that we are facing in navigating the global economic outlook, which is becoming more and more challenging. So I do hope at the global level, there will be more concerted effort on how we are going to establish a better resilience and sustainability of the food. Another thing that we would like to also discuss is, of course, Kristalina mentioned the work with the WTO. I think on a trade and using the policy instrument like import or export tariff, on the one hand, it's of course will not be recommended because it can exacerbate the situation. But many countries usually when they are facing with this kind of challenge, they have to rely on this kind of instrument. For example, when they see that many food has been outgoing from the country while they also need, so there is always a like trade-off between domestic obligation and the need to supply the export side. In Indonesia, this is also the case for example, like CPO. So this is going to be one of the area in which IMF, World Bank, WTO can actually provide what kind of global trade regime which providing more stability both domestically as well as globally. Because when you are facing with the trade-off, all countries will look at their own national interest first. And that will not good from the global solution. That's definitely not good. But that's usually the political choice in which the leader usually pick, that is protecting your own domestic first. And that is exactly when you're dealing with the food, you cannot like delay because people have to eat 3 times a day. And that is exactly that it's going to be like the policy pressure that need to be defined. And that's why the discussion about the food security, what kind of stabilization mechanism that can be built by country, whether this is in the form of stock, buffer, or intervention, which is justified short-term, medium, and long-term. I think that is going to be very important. So within this G20, I would welcome, of course, all the analytical as well as policy, in this case, review that will be done by international institutions like IMF, World Bank, WTO, as well as FAO, or in this case, IFAD, which is, I think, we also support very strongly. I think this is going to be one of the most important to contribute in this very critical issue when we are discussing on a global economic recovery, which is undermined by many shocks at this very moment. We are not yet done with the pandemic. Now we are dealing with the food and supply chains issue, energy issue, and then the war in Ukraine. So that's hopefully will help. And Indonesia, of course, very much looking forward to coordinate, cooperate, collaborate with United States and other institutions in order for us to be able to use this G20 forum to address the issue, which is critically important for all members, not only G20, but also the world. Thank you so much, Alexia.
Thank you so much, Madam Minister. You raised a lot of very tricky political issues and policy trade-off issues, including around open trade. So that's a bigger debate, as well as the use of smart subsidies. And of course, your point about inviting in the private sector, which hadn't been raised before. So thank you so much, Madam Minister. So now for our final speaker, German Finance Minister Christian Lindner, who joins us in his capacity as G7 Finance Chair via pre-recorded video. If I can please ask the video to come on to conclude our opening session.
Dear Janet and dear colleagues, thank you very much for the opportunity to deliver this short video message to you while I'm on my way to DC to meet you all in person. Deeply concerned by the unprovoked Russian aggression, I'm delivering this message in my capacity as German Finance Minister and as well as the current G7 presidency. The Russian attack has caused a food security crisis, and it is worsening by the day. Apart from Ukraine, the most heavily affected are a number of developing countries, especially those with heavy dependencies on Ukrainian and Russian food exports. Targeted and coordinated multi-stakeholder action is necessary now. The International Financial Institutions Action Plan to address food insecurity provides a platform to channel joint action. And we should also fully support and align with the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance, led by the UN Secretary General. As G7 presidency, Germany calls on all of us to spearhead these efforts. The rightful sanctions against the Putin regime do not pertain to exports of agricultural commodities. And still, I reiterate our call to all countries to keep agricultural markets open, not stockpile, not withhold stocks, and not impose unjustified export restrictions on agricultural products or imprints. Our priority must be efficient, effective, timely, and targeted multi-stakeholder action, building on existing cooperation for and work streams, avoiding duplications. In order to facilitate this, the G7 have assembled jointly with the international financial institutions a group of like-minded governments, organizations and institutions that commit to act in an agile manner. In doing so, we will strive to bring all actors to the table. We call on international institutions and UN Rome-based agencies to continue to keep the crisis on their political agenda, sharing information on developments and supporting the UN Secretary General's efforts. We explicitly commit to continue our work towards sustainable and resilient agriculture and food systems. Let me conclude. The G7 will play their part to countering consequences and spillovers of the Russian aggression, and we will work towards ensuring food security for the most vulnerable in these turbulent times. I'm very much looking forward to working with you all on this important challenge.
Thank you so much, Minister Lindner. A very strong call for open markets, open trade, as well as leveraging existing capacity and instruments. So it now leaves me to thank you, and I'm sure that Secretary Yellen also joins me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their clear and forthright messages today. This now ends the opening panel, and we will transition to a closed-door technical session with the international financial institutions to discuss specific actions and approaches to an effective and coordinated response. And you all, dear opening panel, gave us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.